Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our early morning panel session. I hope you've had some coffee, and we're really happy to have you here with us this morning. We're thrilled to be launching the Asia Food Challenge report, officially launched last night and authored by Temasek, PwC, Terrascope, and Rabobank. So it's been a very great collaborative effort producing this. It's the first year that Terrascope hasn't been involved as a co-author, really showing the value of kind of building trust in data and the monitoring and verification piece of the coin. So before I get started, I did want to delve a little bit into profiles. I think so. Julie has an amazing background in West Africa, looking at coming from the cotton industry and kind of really working on the ground, and then joining Olam and moving over to Singapore. So coming from the kind of field-based farmer perspective, and another Africa link. So Miguel is originally from South Africa, coming at from the data science perspective. And so I really enjoy that kind of regional cross-collaboration and synergies as well. And so heading into the key messages from the report, I'll share a few high-level takeaways, and then, which you've already seen kind of rolling on the screen. Hopefully you've absorbed some of those messages. And then we'll open it up for a Q&A with the audience as well. So just to set the scene with what's at stake, I think it's always important to remember why we're here. And really the plant physiology thresholds. So we're looking at global warming, and that's going to have direct impacts on yield, even as we head into more demand for food globally. And so this year, actually, the World Meteorological Organization did publish a report that said Asia is the most disaster-impacted region, with 81 weather, climate, and water-related disasters in 2022 alone. And so Asia is really seen as a victim, and specifically the agri-food sector in this region is a victim of climate change. As the report goes into, it's also a major source of emissions. And so we are looking at, within the region, about, on average, 26% of the region's emissions, carbon emissions, coming from food and agriculture. There's a lot of regional variation, though. So in China, that share from food and ag is actually much lower. We're looking at 17%, whereas Southeast Asia, so where we're based today, it's half. Food and agri is actually half of the regional emissions. And so we see food and agri as major victim, but also major source. And so therefore part of the solution. And that's what we really want to focus on today, are the solution orientation of it. So the report of this kind of 50% of emissions in Southeast Asia, we identify 5 problem areas: rice, fertilizer use, livestock, food loss and food waste, and deforestation. So of those 5 areas, that is the share of the region's emissions. And so really trying to focus on looking at materiality and focusing efforts where there will be the highest payoff. And there is huge potential to reduce. So we've identified, and we'll delve into some of the solutions, both practices and technologies, to reduce emissions in those 5 hotspot areas. One thing to just set the scene is that these emissions, 2/3 of them are coming before the produce even leaves the farm gate. And so if we think about the value chain upstream on the farm, is really where we need to be prioritizing our effort to have the big impact. And that's a big challenge. So with those scene-setting remarks, those were my kind of the key takeaways that we've seen. And I'd love to start with you, Julie, about what were some of the maybe 2 to 3 takeaways that you, reading through the report, felt resonated.
Yeah, thanks, Lia. I found it really great that the report brought out clearly how much of the emissions in South and Southeast Asia are from the agri and food sector. I think a lot of us have been hearing or quoting a number that, 1/3 of global emissions come from this sector. And that's true globally. But here in South and South Asia, Southeast and South Asia, it's about half of global emissions, which also means that this is where we've got to find the solutions. And you've just mentioned, the 5 areas that the report has identified as being responsible for about half of that half. So it really helps us to hone in on where we can make a difference. And that's all the more important, again, in this region where, half of the world's undernourished people, half of the world's 800 million undernourished people are in this Asian Pacific region. And we've also got about 450 million smallholder farmers, about 3/4 of the smallholder farmers. So the report has helped to identify where we need to make change. I also liked the focus on approaches that we can take right now. We talk a lot about innovation, and that is always going to be important. But there's a lot of innovation that's already been done, and we just need to figure out how to enable farmers and companies to adopt these. And those enabling factors, there's a number of them, from finance incentives, et cetera. But a lot of it is just getting that technology out there on the ground. So I think the report gives quite a bit of hope and direction for what we can practically do right now to reduce those emissions for that half of emissions that are coming from this sector.
Thanks so much. And Miguel, what were 3 of the takeaways from the report?
After that thorough summary, let me see if I could find some stuff. I echo a lot of what Julie said. I think it was really great that it went to so much depth into analyzing all of the different technologies and solutions that we already have in our back pocket that we could then use to solve the crisis here in Asia. I think it's, to Julie's point, it looked at practical solutions. It did look at some of the future technologies, but as we already have a lot of stuff that we can do right now, and then linking all of it together. So it's not just about, it's the technologies, it's the finance, it's the gaps, it's all of the things that we need in order to solve the problems. I think it does, obviously, as with anything, right, open up, okay, so what are now the execution challenges? Because this is laying out the problem and laying out some of the things we need to do and some of the areas we should focus on. But then it's about, okay, now thinking about how do we actually go and execute? And then I guess one of the other things challenging me with being a data background is then how do we track, right? So there's all of this, we can achieve all of these reductions, but how do we actually track that it's happening?
I hope you have some answers for us on that one. Which I'll circle back to you on that. So what are these technologies and practices? So the report really looks at, those 5 problem areas, but I'm going to focus in on rice cultivation. So there's simulations around alternate wet drying. So instead of having rice fields submerged in water the whole time, which creates a lot of methane, it's actually a practice of switching to drying the fields and allowing the water to go down to a certain depth and then replenishing. So alternate wet drying. Straw collection, so collecting the residual waste from the fields, biochar, no-till or low-till, and looking at rice genetics. So those were some of the technologies, in particular, alternate wet drying, very low investment cost. It's just kind of a behavioral change, really. On fertilizer use, a big one is site-specific nutrient management, where I think the interesting one here is that fertilizer is often very subsidized. So if you look at the true cost of fertilizer, there's a big emissions impact. And so just apply what's needed rather than putting too much fertilizer on the fields. And then food loss and waste. And so in particular, the food loss piece is rice, maximizing the storage and kind of the infrastructure. Sometimes it can be very decentralized and also low investment. But that one is a key to just maximizing our supply, our food system. So that one, we look particularly at hermetic storage, just storing with barriers to the air. Sounds simple, but as we said, these are really high payoff, low investment cost solutions, and how do we kind of get them on deployed? And so, Julia, I'd love to understand a little bit about how you're addressing that challenge of where there's low cost, high impact, kind of that no regrets solutions. How do you connect with the smallholder farms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, basically everything you've just mentioned, we are implementing in many of our rice programs across India, Vietnam, Thailand, also in West Africa. And we're seeing they're quite effective at not only reducing carbon emissions, but often reducing costs and improving the profits for the farmers and without compromising on the yield. So it's like, it sounds too good to be true. So the only thing is it needs that little bit of a push to enable farmers to like get that access to training and sometimes some basic technology. So a couple of examples, you mentioned alternate wetting and drying, site-specific nutrient management. In site-specific nutrient management, for example, we trained about 35,000 farmers across Vietnam and Thailand over the past 3 to 4 years. For a large portion of the ones in Thailand, we also enabled them to actually measure the soil nutrients through quite simple technology that enabled them to actually mix the fertilizers, specific to their sites. And it's actually quite interesting because in Thailand, they got the different components of fertilizers and they can mix it. In Vietnam, they get a standard mix, so it's more a question of just how much are they applying. And in both cases, they were able to reduce their fertilizer application, and that obviously reduced greenhouse gas emissions because they were simply over-applying. But we did see a difference between the overall reduction. So there was a greater reduction in Thailand where these simple soil tests enabled them to do a very specific mixing. They got about 38% lower emissions in Thailand and about 11% lower in Vietnam. So both were positive, but it helped us to also learn what was more effective in the training, in the mixing and such, so that we can, build on that in the next phase of the program. We also looked at the SROI, so the social return on investment, and basically found that it was about 2.5 to 1, meaning for every dollar invested, we got about, or like the whole, let's say everyone collectively, the farmers and the environment, got about $2.5 positive return. We tried many of the other ones you've mentioned, hermetic storage, for example, in wheat in West Africa, various improved harvesting tools. So there's quite a bit that can be practically implemented. And of course, all of this in collaboration with partners like Erie that helps with the methane measurement in particular, so we can really understand what are those impacts in, and how those vary, not just based on the differences in how methodologies are applied, but even the differences in the region and the soils where we are. So there's Erie, GIZ, Jeff, UNDP, UN Women, all of us working together along with the government to help promote these practices.
And follow-up is that social return on investment, did that also translate into dollars that the farmers receive? Because if we think about scale, I think farmers need to see it translate into money in the pocket. And so was it a case where they saw that return on investment, or is there more intervention needed? And I think the report specifically looks at functional consolidation. So working with smallholder farmers and looking at cooperatives and other ways to organize and scale good practices. But I'd love to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. So that calculation does take into account the actual hard dollar returns that the farmers got, which is more than half of that. So they got a positive return overall, and then some of the additional, some of that SROI is about the social value coming from improved health due to less water pollution and things like that. But in terms of hard cash, yes, they got it. But another step that we are working on and looking towards is, for example, enabling farmers to have access to carbon markets so that as they're reducing their methane emissions, they can tap into that and further improve their incomes.
Are there any other kind of alternative revenue streams that you think will help to unlock that scale?
I mean, that's a challenging one. When we look at everything that we're doing in regenerative agriculture, so that's also looking at other practices that are mentioned in the report, mulching and composting and all these different things that put more carbon back into the soil and that reduce use. We see a few ways that generates value. So first, there's this inherent value that comes because costs are reduced or because yields can increase. But of course, in some of these practices, it may take 1 year, it may take 3 or 4 years to really see that practical increase. And of course, there we have the challenge of financing the transition. But that may go beyond this particular discussion. But there's a lot of cases where we see that immediate costs, like profits proposition, like coming in within 1 year or 2 years. There's also the opportunity to tap into premium markets, certified markets. So we're very proud to be working now with Regen Agri certification in several of our cotton supply chains, for example. And we hope that that's going to help get more value back to the farmers for those efforts that they're making in regenerative practices. Yeah, of course, carbon markets. Still, there's question marks on how to help smallholders tap into it. That requires a lot of improvements in terms of measurement, methodologies, aggregation of that data. But there's already a lot of positive progress in terms of systems and MRVs that are enabling that.
Excellent. Good segue to Miguel. And after that, I'm going to open up to the audience. So please have your questions ready. I'd love to make this an interactive exchange. So you mentioned the MRV, the monitoring, reporting, verification piece. How do we tie that in with the finance? So what are some of the trends around from the data science perspective? If we're looking at investments and that comes with accountability, how are we improving on the MRV side?
I guess before I go into that, maybe I'll just explain why MRV is so important. I mean, we've talked a bit about it, but let's go into AWD, right? So the impact of AWD actually varies. It's quite significant. I think our models estimate that it can go from 30% reduction to 70%, right? That's a massive swing. And that depends on the situation on the ground, which is, have they included the straw into the soil? What is the type of soil? What is the climate? All of these things. So you really need to be able to measure what's happening on the ground. And I think Julie mentioned quite a lot around, there are some small-scale solutions where you can start talking directly to farmers and all this stuff. But a lot of these things you will struggle to scale, right? Especially with some of the fragmented nature of some of these supply chains, and often you don't have visibility or traceability of where you're buying things from. So what's happening in the market is there's a lot of need for multiple types of MRV solutions, right? Some of these are satellite-based, looking at that satellite imagery to then see, okay, can I identify the methane on the ground, right? And see what is the methane flux coming from different sites. Some of them are drone-based, right? So can I send drones out to then monitor this? There's also, I guess, if you can create some low-cost measurement solutions and then have some kind of connection between farmers to then share that data and then have consistency in terms of how you collect and validate that the information is coming through. Because obviously your model's only as good as the data that you get. So, and you need to incentivize farmers to give you good data, right? Because you don't want them to say, hey, all of my emissions are low, because then you'll pay me good money for that. And I think it's still there's lots of interesting growth in this space. And I think it's also linked a lot to the, if you go more broadly, not just rice, but start looking at some of the tree crops, right? Then you're looking at the linking into the carbon market space, right? Which is then a lot of the technologies used for tracking forest projects is starting to shift now into the broader ag and the carbon GHG and carbon tracking.
Is the carbon markets the way to do it? How does it show up in the corporate inventory?
Maybe carbon markets is a bad example at the moment because of all of the negative press that's happening on it. But I think there's a lot of valuable things in how carbon markets go about doing it. Obviously, it can be improved. And I think there's also, at least there's some level of rigor and consistency. So I think regardless if it's the carbon markets approach or if it's another approach, there needs to be a consistent framework in terms of how these things are measured and how they're accounted for. And then ultimately, so as part of putting it into your inventory, you do need to have some kind of the new regulations and guidance from GHG require you to have a constant monitoring solution in place, not just for your own farms, but also for your supply chain. So this type of solution is needed.
Great, thanks. Well, if you haven't been up all night reading the report, because it was only launched last night, this is your chance to ask about what are the key messages, what went into behind the scenes work, in particular with kind of the simulations and others. So any questions coming from the floor? Please introduce yourself as well.
Hi, Nitish from UltraNutri from India. Just wanted to get your thoughts on the agri residues. For example, India produces 500 million tons of agri residues, which are generally indigestible in nature and most likely burnt away. I mean, 450 of the 500 million tons are burnt away every year. You may have seen our capital getting choked almost every season because of this. So what are your thoughts on this particular aspect?
Would you like to take that one from the residue?
Yeah, I could maybe say a couple of words there. The conversion of agri-residues into, say, biochar is obviously one of the promising areas, but it does vary for which type of residue. In some with, cashew shell is going to have a very different conversion rate from, say, a rice straw. Although there's other things that we found. So we have done trials in biochar with rice straw. We're currently doing trials on biochar from cotton. And for example, in rice straw, while the conversion to biochar may be not so high, but then there's other things there, such as silica and such, which can also be harnessed. So the biggest challenge that we're finding when it comes to the residues which are left on the field, as opposed to, say, a byproduct of processing, again, those cashew shells would be all sitting around a factory. So it's, it's very easy to have this massive quantity of cashew shells and then set up some plant and make that a bit cost effective. But you've got these, widely dispersed smallholder farms with their crop residues. How do we enable them to, in a very simple way, convert residues to biochar? Biochar is just one thing. Obviously, there's compost and there's many other things you can do with it. Simply using it for mulching. We actually use crop residues for soil erosion control as a physical barrier to erosion. So there's a lot of useful things to do with the crop residues. But we've tried a couple of different methodologies, like the Kontiki method, which involves sort of, let's say, digging a pit, but the pit has to be dug in a very special way with certain angles so that basically the heat can stay inside, it can pyrolyze, and the carbon doesn't kind of come out of the pit, but it stays in. There's this top-down burn method. There's various methods that we're trying to make it cost-effective and make it something that farmers can do on their own field in that smallholder farming context.
And Miguel, how would this show up in a corporate inventory? So let's say a retailer is sourcing ingredients from an area with high kind of burning of the residual. How would that show up if the practice changes?
That's a tricky question. The reason I say it's tricky is because of the visibility that a lot of retailers have on the practices on the ground. So what's happening at the moment is a retailer would use what's called a default emission factor, which essentially says what is the average of what is happening in India, right? And therefore, that is what I apply to the product that I'm buying from India. However, that then doesn't tell you that if, as some of the stuff that Julie was mentioning, if this farmer is applying all of these practices. So you actually, and then going back to my point around farm traceability, is in order to measure all of these things and see what's happening, you need to be able to get traceability down to the farm and see what are the practices that are happening. So long answer to your question is it doesn't really show up on the inventory at the moment.
Okay, there you go. Another question. Oh, a couple. So we'll take gentleman at the front.
Hi, I'm Chris Justice from Tingo Agritech. It's great to see we focus on preserving the food that we already grow. So preserving food loss, as I think it's great to see the report noted the use of hermetic cocoon storage for certain types of foods, which can reduce the post-harvest spoilage. But there are other technologies that can be applied as well to cleanse the food before it goes into hermetic storage for rice and grains, because that can kill the larva so that they can't spawn ultimately and continue to eat the food. But also they can be applied to all kinds of foods to extend shelf life, to reduce, and if we extend the shelf life, reduce the food loss, then we're reducing the amount of food that goes into landfills, which produces significant amounts of greenhouse gas. 40% of Asia's food loss is between harvest and consumer, right? Are you seeing technologies or initiatives that are addressing that part of the problem? Cultivation is obviously important, but a third of it maybe can be addressed today through quite simple methodologies. Do you see any of that in the report or the research?
Do you like to? Looks like you've got something to say.
No, I mean, I think the only thing I would have to say is, we've done a baseline study of across 10 value chains in the past year of where are those food losses happening from the farmer. This was on smallholder farmer value chains. So from the farmers before it reaches us. And absolutely, one of the key areas is storage. Of course, there's also during harvest and some of the post-harvest, threshing practices, but storage is a key one. And it's really from two things. It's either humidity, so storing at when it's too wet and it gets spoilt and moldy, and or the insect attacks that you've mentioned. So I would just emphasize that is definitely a need to find cost-effective solutions that the farmers can access.
Yeah, it's significant that one of the 5 was food loss and food waste. It shows that this is really going to move the needle on it. Follow up, I see.
Yeah, sorry, just a quick follow up. So the food loss, a lot of rice, for example, is lost in the mills. 20 to 30% average losses of rice in the mills to insects, larvae, mold. That can be treated with electron beam kinds of treatment that, of course, are not inexpensive, but if you can set up a service center to service lots of mills in the rice producing areas, you can reduce those losses to less than 1%. We're doing a project in Egypt where to treat 450,000 tons of Egyptian rice the government buys for food storage, taking the losses down, and right now it's 15 to 25%. To less than 1%. The value of that is enormous. Customers get 3 to 4 times more value than what it would cost to actually provide the service. And you reduce 450,000 tons is reducing 650,000 tons of greenhouse gas because 85% of that is going into landfill, the rice that's spoiled. It applies to fish. Yeah. It applies to grain, all kinds of grains. It applies to fruits. So it's a technology that's available today to actually make a big impact. And smallholder farms are really important, but it's also very difficult because there's so many. When you aggregate the food and then address some issues at that end of the supply chain, big impact can be had pretty quickly, I think.
So Miguel, in the value chain mapping, how are you seeing food loss showing up in some of the corporate inventories?
Yeah, so I think it varies depending on where in the value chain you are, right? Because food loss can go all the way up, right? So it's not just in the producer side. It's also on the flip side. If you're buying, then you get food loss throughout. But yes, a large part of it is in the processing and the growing. Again, to my point though is. Unless you have this, just purely from a traceability standpoint, unless you have this data, it becomes very hard. I think some databases do have some assumptions on that, and that's purely based on studies at the moment. So getting that visibility in that first-party data or better modeling on some of these value chains would be super important.
So starting with assumptions, moving into supplier-specific data collection, and then helping kind of build that accountability around reducing the losses. Yeah, from an enabling action perspective.
Right. And I think also the way we do it with our clients is we 80-20, right? So we focus on where the big levers, right? So and rice is a big one, but I think it depends. So like if someone that buys beef would be different problems. I think it's not really about food loss there. It's more about the methane, the enteric fermentation, etc. Yeah.
And also, as the hotspot, so if that supplier has addressed alternate wet drying up on the farm, reduced methane, then processing becomes a bigger hotspot. And so it's a kind of continuous, as it should be, right? As we progress on net zero, a continuous move towards benefits and reduction. We had a question over. Yes, please.
This is Diraj from Kargil. I mean, of course, as I was reflecting about this topic, this is not just important for our grandchildren's future, but now increasingly our future as well. And we focus a lot on topics on the upstream part. So, of course, if it can increase yields or SROI or low investment, we should do it just because of financial prudence, not to decarbonize. But there's other part where Julie touched upon a little bit where big investments are required, where you don't see the ROI, now. But like, for example, Regen Ag, which requires a lot of millions of dollars. But in Europe and US, consumers are okay to pay now, increasingly, with different kind of tradings. But in Asia, we are not seeing. And that's I think, a big part where we can decarbonize. It, of course, is not the top 5 topics, probably. How do we make those choices? Because there are 2 stakeholders, or probably 3. One is consumers. So in Asia, I believe in this room, might people care about paying more, but in general not. Our customers like FMCG companies, if consumers are not paying, they don't want to invest, but maybe they have a certain commitment, so they might pay extra. But then suppliers like us or farmers, why they do it? So it's a problem, and how kind of we break this, because I believe where we can increase the yield, yes, we should do it. But the bigger problem is like where we don't see a big financial incentive to do it for farmers or middlemen, like probably Olam and Kargil as well. How do we solve that?
It comes back a lot to the financial. I think farmers we know aren't going to do it unless the economics make sense. So any reflections on that question?
It's indeed a big challenge, which starts with the measurement, because if we're not able to measure properly, it's quite difficult to make the case. I'm probably jumping ahead. One point is the consumer point, but a lot of the commodities that we're talking about, if we're thinking of rice, wheat and such, consumers are frankly not willing to pay extra. I mean, the niche market that's there that might pay a premium for sustainably grown commodity types of products, it's very small, and it is something to embrace and to find and to grow, but it's not going to be a massive portion of the market. So we clearly have to find other ways to pay for it. Some of the ways include like sustainability-linked loans, which can give a reduced rate. Those sustainability-linked loans, though, farmers don't tend to have access to. It's big corporations like ours which can help enable the farmers to get that access, because we want to decarbonize. We can set a goal. We can prove that it's actually working, with the help of tools like Terrascope and others, and MRVs as discussed, so we can show this is how much we're getting towards our goal, and that can help us get at least a slightly reduced interest rate on loans. That's one thing that's there. I think one that's probably not quite developed even as much as the sustainability-linked loans that would be in the insurance area. So if we layer on top of those loans, insurance companies are rewarding farms and businesses that are able to show reduced risk and reduced emissions. That's another area where I think that can be developed. Carbon markets, it's up and down. I think that's like a whole other discussion, but there's still potential for sure there. But yeah, it's definitely a common challenge.
And a lot of it also comes back to trust. So will the consumer, if there's a kind of kg of emissions equivalent listed on that package, does the consumer trust it? And so what's the role, especially, I'm going to shout out to Miguel's financial crime analytics background. He did a few years in this industry, and I think carbon is increasingly linked or compared to financial data, and we look at the integration of the two. So it would be interesting. How do you see kind of the monitoring and verification, both from the government pressure as well as the consumer pressure coming together to deal with some of these challenges?
Yeah, I guess because with anything, there's the pressure to decarbonize, but then there's the cost element, right? So there will always be, people will always try and game the system, right, to figure out, okay, how do I maximize my return, right? And therefore, as I've mentioned, you really need to be very careful about the data you're getting, and how do you verify that data? There are solutions out there which kind of try and reduce the qualitative nature of things. So maybe you could go with a blockchain type solution where you can get full traceability of the value chain. I think there's also even more basic ones where you get a third party involved to do verification of what's happening on the ground. So you don't have to do verification of the entire supply chain, but look at risk areas. And this is back to your question around financial crime. It's you wouldn't necessarily look at every single transaction in detail, right? You'd identify what are the risky ones, and then that brings up an interesting point. So, okay, so how much data would you need in order to determine which of these suppliers are risky suppliers, where the data seems a bit abnormal? So what is an anomaly based on, if you look at this supplier versus the region, does it make sense that that they've managed 80% reduction in carbon, whereas the rest of the suppliers have not? And there you can look at costs. So, is their cost of what they're giving you the same as the others? Then maybe there's a problem, right? And then you then have some kind of verification system in place to check those.
Excellent. Thanks. Any other questions for the audience? Yes.
Okay, Rob Holm from the Borealis Group.
Great.
I think it's really good to hear that somehow food security and decarbonisation are not sort of mutually exclusive, they're connected. And also water security. I think that's probably the elephant in the room. I think on the back of the Kariba project, which is somehow the elephant in the room in terms of investment sentiment, I think the other piece is extension. It doesn't seem to be a technical challenge as much as one for attracting investment, but also extension of existing good agricultural practice. How do we actually get better coordination? We have GrowAsia, we have fantastic platforms here. How do we avoid duplication and get better coordination so that we can get scale and impact?
Wonderful. Better coordination. Any taker?
I mean, the farm extension landscape varies, as you know, widely from country to country. Sometimes it's very well done through government bodies that have representatives all over the ground. Sometimes there's nothing at all. There's many countries where we work in where we're the only people farmers see visiting their village. You know, at least they know that somebody from Olam Agri is going to come around once every 2 weeks and not only give them farm extension support, but they're going to, give them news of the world. So it can vary quite a bit. But I think you mentioned something we didn't talk about much today that is mentioned in the report around sort of the use of, say, farmer groups and lead farmers and such like that, such systems to really reach out to the farmers. So I think a lot of these systems also where probably a lot of us would be familiar with the idea of having cooperatives that can have the capacity, have their own, say, agronomists and such, who have the capacity to get that information from whoever, whether it's a company or a government or research institution, and then pass that on to the farmers. You also have the lead farmer model, which may not be in a cooperative, but just a model farmer within a community. I think there's a gender aspect in many of the countries, say in India, West Africa, that the gender aspect can be quite important to take into account here. Less relevant, say, for Vietnam and Thailand, where there's a bit more equity a bit in the farming, in the rural farming communities in terms of power and voice over decisions like where do we farm, what do we do with the money. But some countries, Indonesia, India, West Africa, you see big disparities. And that's where you need to look at options like, first of all, having women who are extension workers. We have a program called the Krishi Sakis in India, where the women themselves go out, and they can't go out one by one because their husbands won't let them, but they go out as a small group. And now as a group, they go around, they train women, and to the point where now they go from even to different states to train other women how to be Krishi Sakis. So this is one thing. There's also the power of digital tools. Women, as we see more and more mobile penetration, more and more women are also having a closer to equal access to those mobile phones. And in many communities and cultures, while they can't sit in a community meeting, sometimes they can't sit in a community meeting or a farmer training at all, or sometimes they can sit, but they're in the back of the room or they can't talk. But delivering information through mobile phones helps to, democratize their access to that extension service.
Great. So bottom-up, cooperative, definitely a role for government extension services and kind of tailoring that unique approach and aligning. So the report does talk about different roles of different stakeholders and also the finance and investment and looking at that. Did you want to add?
No, I was just saying that also I guess at a big corporate level, you're already seeing a lot of this cooperation happening. I mean, a couple of examples is Tract that Olam recently launched, which is a coalition between Olam, Cargill, and a few others around, in terms of how to better manage the ESG space, right? Try to cooperate in that. And then I guess the other one that I can think of is, my answer is always going to be data related, right? But it's the WBCSD PACT framework, which is around...
a lot of acronyms. World Business Council on Sustainable Development. They have a transparency, which does.
Correct, which is about sharing product level data between companies so that you have consistency in terms of the data that's shared and also visibility around all of this data that's coming through.
Great, thanks. And I think that call out on the linkage between the resilience and the emissions piece, very important for getting all the stakeholders on board. So let's take the two questions together, if that's okay. I think we had one, and then we'll have one round to close.
Hello. Hi, I'm Shami with BenQ. We are into supply chain automation through blockchain. Shifting the topic a little bit here to value chain, supply chains. And I understand we are focused on Asia, but let's be true. The supply chain these days are crossing continents, right? A lot of farmers in India and Asia are producing for foreign countries, right? The latest that happened was Walmart in US just shoved a product, a high-end cotton company, off the shelves because there was no polygon attached to it. The EUDR laws. So when we track back our footsteps, right, aggregated data will not be enough in days to come. So how do you think that challenge can be foreseen when the actual, the audit is going to happen for EUDRs and laws like this? And how do we safeguard our Indian farmers rather than companies saying, you know what, let's just stick with the farmers who can provide that kind of data to us?
Great provocation there. And we had a question at the front.
Thank you very much, and I'll make this quick. Mike Prowse from Bear Crop Science. And maybe kind of ending on a hopeful note. You mentioned in the beginning the statistic of half of Southeast Asia's emissions come from agri. China, it's only 17%, but I imagine behind that is also the fact that the economic activity in China is much more carbon intensive in construction and manufacturing. So if maybe you're kind of double clicking on Southeast Asia and where the opportunity is to reduce carbon in maybe a particular geography or even a particular crop, what would that be? And is it driven by the crop? And we've talked a lot about rice. We've talked a lot about gender equity and how that relates to decarbonization. Is it driven by the crop, or are there other major socio-political economic factors which are also kind of creating that decarbonization opportunity in that particular geography?
Interesting. Two very different questions. So it's a nice challenge to try to answer both, or to divide and conquer as you wish. But great one around kind of the transition and what does this mean for who produce may end up coming from, as well as the kind of macro dynamic.
I'm happy to, maybe I'll take the stab at the first one. So there, I think, especially with our European clients, we're seeing a lot of uncertainty in terms of how the EUDR will play out, because it's hard, near to impossible for them at the moment to get that visibility. I think the other problem that's happening in Europe is there's a lack of funding for a lot of these customers to implement solutions that will provide that traceability, right? So it's a bit of a wait and see, to be honest, right? Because there's no feasible solution at the moment to achieve that traceability within the timelines that are expected. Because there is at least in my mind, I think there's an understanding that you can't change farmers, because there's not going to be enough farmers that are meeting these requirements to meet the volumes that are needed. So that's not a solution. The solution is more about how do you then implement these programs with sufficient scale. I don't think changing suppliers is going to be a solution.
Great. And some final words on the macro, potentially the government policies looking at the regional diversity.
I think I wouldn't be the best place to answer to the policy aspect of the question, but I think that your question was also saying, is it driven by the particular crops? Is that where the opportunities are coming from? And for that, I mean, rice has been called out a lot, but it's really been called out for a reason, because in Southeast Asia, the region that you're talking about, this is the sort of the bread basket, well, the rice basket, I guess, for the world, for rice. And rice does, the cultivation results in a lot of methane emissions. And methane has a global warming potential over a 20-year period that's 80 times higher than carbon dioxide. That's just becoming recognized. And actually, whether from rice or many, many other sources, the increase in methane is growing faster than even models are predicting. So we know that we need to focus on methane, and rice in this region is the key crop to focus on. Not to say that we shouldn't look at regenerative agriculture for all the crops that we're growing.
Great. Thank you for your wonderful questions. We're at time. Please let the conversation continue over some coffee and tea. I hope you've had some actionable insights and reflections on how we do this better together and faster to meet our ambitions. So thank you very much for joining us this morning.